Two of the most powerful men on Earth sat across from each other in Beijing today. One came wanting a deal. The other came with a warning. And when the meeting ended, the two sides couldn't even agree on what was said in the room. The Americans put it in writing. The Chinese released something different. Completely different. That gap, that silence where agreement should be, is the most important thing that happened today, and almost nobody is talking about it. Today, May 14, 2026, Beijing, China. President Donald Trump landed at one of the most symbolically loaded addresses on Earth, the Great Hall of the People, for the first day of what is being called one of the highest stakes bilateral summits in years. China rolled out the full ceremony, an elaborate military welcome, friendly rhetoric, both leaders speaking about cooperation and the deep history of U.S.-China ties. Trump called it an honor to be a friend to Xi Jinping, referring to him as a great leader. A White House official described the meeting as good. On paper, it looked like a diplomatic success. Two superpowers in the same room talking. But pull back the curtain and a different picture emerges. One shaped by contradictions, strategic maneuvering, and a warning delivered so calmly it almost sounded polite. If you want clear, fact-first coverage of one of the most consequential geopolitical moments of this decade, subscribe now, because this story is moving fast, and the next 24 hours could define the entire outcome. Let's go through exactly what we know. Trump arrived in Beijing with a specific agenda. His administration wanted three things: progress on trade, a commitment from China to help end the Iran war, and some kind of guardrail on the spiraling tensions that nearly tipped out of control last year. Both the US and China had publicly said their ties were broadly stable heading into this summit, and both said they intended to keep it that way. That much aligned. The opening ceremony delivered exactly what you'd expect when two nations want to look cooperative on camera. Beijing knows Trump likes the red carpet, and China delivered. Military pomp, warm handshakes, and public statements emphasizing shared history. Then the details came out. On trade. Trade envoys had already met the day before in a preparatory session with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, reaching what she described as overall balanced and positive outcomes. She said both sides should work together to preserve this hard-won positive momentum, and that Beijing's door to opening up will only open wider. The White House readout included expanded access for American businesses in China, increased Chinese purchases of U.S. agricultural products, and continued pressure on fentanyl flows. Treasury Secretary Bessent also announced that the two sides would discuss forming boards of trade and investment to manage bilateral commerce in non-sensitive areas. And then there was AI. Bessent said the two leaders would begin discussions on artificial intelligence, describing it as the two AI superpowers starting to talk, with a goal of establishing protocols and best practices to ensure non-state actors don't gain access to AI models. That's a significant development. Two nations that are competitors in the most consequential technology race of this century agreeing to at least set up a framework for conversation. That alone would be major news on any other day. But it was the Iran discussion, or rather what happened after it, that raised the most serious questions. The Trump administration went into this summit asking China to use its influence over Tehran to help end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply currently flows, caught in the crosshairs of an active conflict. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in a pre-taped interview aired before the bilateral meeting, said, "It's in their interest to resolve this. We hope to convince them to play a more active role in getting Iran to walk away from what they're doing now." The White House readout of the Trump-Xi meeting said the two sides agreed the Strait of Hormuz must remain open and that Iran can never acquire a nuclear weapon. Clear, specific, committed. Then Beijing released its version. The Chinese readout of the same meeting didn't mention Iran's nuclear program. It didn't mention the Strait of Hormuz. It said only that the Middle East was discussed. Same meeting, same room, two completely different accounts of what was agreed. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's a diplomatic signal. And behind it sits the most uncomfortable question of this entire summit. What exactly did China actually commit to? China didn't just stay quiet on Iran. Beijing released a statement so vague it could mean almost anything. And the silence, what was not said, may be the most telling detail from day one. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what's at stake beyond the diplomacy, and how much of the world is already being shaped by decisions made in that room today. Start with the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil flows through that single narrow corridor. Right now, it is caught inside an active war zone. That's not a metaphor. It's a logistical reality affecting energy prices, shipping routes, and economic stability across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. If China helps bring Iran to the table and the strait reopens, supply chains stabilize, oil prices drop, markets breathe. If China declines to use its leverage or uses the request as a bargaining chip instead of acting on it, the war continues, the strait stays contested, and the pressure on global energy keeps building. According to analysts who have spoken to ABC News, Beijing doesn't want to get pulled in too deep and views this war as fundamentally America's problem to solve. That framing matters. It tells you that whatever China commits to, it will be on China's terms and at a price. Now bring in Taiwan. Xi delivered what was described as a stark warning that if the Taiwan issue is handled improperly, it could lead to conflict. Beijing considers Taiwan a breakaway province run by a separatist government that must eventually be reunified with the Chinese state. The U.S. has long held a policy of strategic ambiguity, not recognizing Taiwan's independence, but also not allowing China to make forceful moves against it. The concern among national security analysts is specific, that Xi will use what Trump wants on Iran and other issues to extract concessions on Taiwan, pushing for reduced U.S. arms sales to the island, or seeking language from Washington that explicitly opposes Taiwanese independence. That's the trade that Washington fears most, quieting China's threat against a democratic island in exchange for helping end a war in the Middle East. Two separate crises, one transaction. And it's not a paranoid scenario. It's the logical pressure point China holds right now. Do you think Beijing will genuinely help end the Iran conflict? Or is this an opportunity for leverage? Let me know in the comments below. A senior economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit described the summit's broader trajectory as signaling a period of managed stability, adding that there will be a guardrail and things won't spiral out of the two sides' control as they nearly did in 2025. That phrase, as they nearly did in 2025, is doing a lot of work. It tells you how close to the edge this relationship actually came. And it tells you the bar for success at this summit is not resolution, it's containment. That's a different kind of summit. Not one where two nations solve problems together, one where they agree carefully on how not to collapse into conflict. Among those who joined Trump's delegation, Elon Musk of Tesla and Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. The presence of tech industry leaders signals something. Both companies have significant exposure to the Chinese market. Both have skin in the game of whether trade relationships stabilize or fracture. Their presence at a geopolitical summit says, quietly, that economic interests are woven directly into the diplomatic conversation. Here's something that deserves more attention than it's getting. Chinese state media is already portraying this visit as a major diplomatic victory for China. And some commentary inside China is framing Trump's trip as proof that he needs Beijing more than Beijing needs him, pointing to Trump's weakened domestic position and the ongoing Iran war amid low approval numbers. So, while Washington presents this summit as a meeting between equals, inside China, the official narrative is something else entirely. Beijing isn't selling cooperation, it's selling dominance. That gap in perception isn't just propaganda. It shapes how each side will negotiate tomorrow and every day after. Set aside the diplomatic language for a moment, the communiques, the readouts, the press conferences. Because somewhere underneath all of it are the people for whom this summit is not about geopolitics. It's about survival. Think about the workers on oil tankers navigating through the Persian Gulf right now, the shipping companies calculating daily whether it's safer to route through a war zone or absorb the cost of the longer path around. The factory managers in South Korea, Japan, and Germany, whose production schedules depend on fuel prices that swing with every news cycle. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction. It is a physical bottleneck, narrow enough to walk across on a map, through which a fifth of the planet's oil passes. When it's threatened, the effect ripples outward instantly. Fuel prices, freight costs, grocery prices, energy bills. Real people feel that. Not in boardrooms, at gas stations, at supermarkets, in the monthly budget math that ordinary families do in countries they can't even locate on a map of the Middle East. The Trump administration came to Beijing specifically asking China to use its influence over Tehran to help reopen the strait and end the war. That ask, however diplomatically phrased, was a recognition that the U.S. alone cannot resolve this, that Beijing holds a key Washington does not. For communities living near military installations, near ports, near energy infrastructure, the question of whether this summit produces results is not academic. It directly shapes their security calculus. Families of service members deployed near the Gulf, workers in industries that depend on stable shipping lanes, governments in smaller nations that have no leverage in this conversation and simply have to absorb whatever the two superpowers decide. And then there's Taiwan. There are 23 million people living on that island who did not get a seat at this table. They are waiting, as they have waited for decades, to learn what two foreign governments decide their future will look like. She warned that if the Taiwan question is handled improperly, it could lead to conflict. For Taiwanese citizens, that warning wasn't diplomatic theater. It was a reminder that their safety depends on whether the man sitting across from Xi holds firm or trades something away. There is a particular kind of anxiety that comes from watching two powerful nations negotiate over your existence. It is not acute panic. It is a low, sustained pressure. The awareness that decisions are being made in rooms you cannot enter, by people whose priorities are not yours. That psychological weight is real. It shapes elections in Taiwan. It shapes business investment decisions. It shapes whether young Taiwanese people believe they have a future on the island their families have called home for generations. Closer to the summit itself, in Beijing, ordinary citizens watched state television broadcast something different. Not the Taiwan warning, not the Iran disagreement. Chinese state media focused on the ceremony, the warmth, the handshakes, and framed the visit as a validation of China's global standing, a moment of arrival on the world stage as an equal power. In some neighborhoods, citizens said they felt pride, not in Trump, in the image of their country commanding this kind of attention. The narrative being delivered domestically was one of Chinese strength, not compromise. That divergence between what citizens in different countries are being told about the same summit is itself a story. When populations are fed fundamentally different versions of reality, the diplomatic agreements their governments reach become increasingly fragile, because they're not supported by a shared understanding of what happened. The farmers in Iowa waiting on expanded agricultural export deals to China, the semiconductor workers watching to see whether AI cooperation frameworks shift the tech competition. The small business owners in coastal Chinese cities, for whom American market access is the difference between growth and stagnation. None of them were in that room. All of them are waiting to find out what was decided for them. Day 2 begins tomorrow, and the hard negotiations start now. The platitudes have been exchanged. The cameras have captured the handshakes. What follows is the part neither government broadcasts live. Will Xi press Trump on Taiwan, asking for concrete language, reduced arms sales, or a shift in Washington's position in exchange for any movement on Iran? And if so, will Trump hold that line? Because the moment that trade becomes explicit, the stability of a democratic island against the stability of a global oil corridor, the implications extend far beyond this summit. Every U.S. ally watching from Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, and Warsaw is asking the same question right now. Step back from the ceremony. step back from the readouts and the contradictions. Look at the architecture of what just happened. Beijing has been deliberately showcasing itself as an equal power standing alongside the United States on the world stage. This summit, the location, the military ceremony, the state dinner at the Great Hall of the People, was not designed primarily for American audiences. It was designed for Chinese citizens, for global South governments, and for every nation currently recalibrating its relationship with both superpowers. The message China is sending to the world is not, "We cooperated with America." It is, "America came to us." That distinction matters in ways that won't show up in any diplomatic communiqué. China, once seen as a nation still catching up technologically, has emerged as a genuine global tech leader and is increasingly confident it can manage its relationship with the United States on its own terms. That confidence changes the negotiation. It changes the posture. A China that believes it can outlast American pressure is a fundamentally different counterpart than one that needs to reach a deal. China's 2025 rare earth export restrictions exposed what analysts described as a critical U.S. national security vulnerability. Washington responded, but the response revealed a dependency that years of supply chain assumptions had buried. That context sits quietly in the background of every trade conversation at this summit. The AI protocol discussion is worth watching carefully. Besant described it as establishing best practices between the two AI superpowers to prevent non-state actors from accessing advanced models. If that framework takes shape, even informally, it represents a kind of cooperation that hasn't existed before. Two nations that compete intensely in AI, agreeing to some form of guardrails. What those guardrails cover and what they exclude will matter enormously. Taiwan remains the pressure point that does not go away. Analysts and intelligence officials have long noted that Taiwan is the most obvious flashpoint, the place where strategic competition could become something else entirely. Xi's warning that improper handling of Taiwan could lead to conflict was not new language. China has said versions of this before. But the setting matters. Delivered directly to Trump in Beijing on day one, it was a statement of priority. This is what Beijing considers non-negotiable. Everything else is trade. What governments are watching now, whether the Taiwan language from Washington shifts even slightly in the coming days, whether a joint communiqué includes phrasing that could be interpreted as Washington distancing itself from Taipei, intelligence agencies will parse every word. What markets are watching, whether the Iran Strait discussion produces any tangible Chinese commitment or remains polite ambiguity dressed as agreement. What history will record? That in May of 2026, two nations sat at the edge of a genuinely consequential set of choices about war, about technology, about the autonomy of 23 million people, and chose, for now, to keep talking. That is not a small thing. The alternative to talking is not silence. It's something worse. But keep talking is not the same as resolved. The gaps in today's readouts, the omissions, the contradictions, the warnings softened into formal language, those will not disappear overnight. They will return, sharper, in the next crisis. Day 2 begins in hours, and the easy part, the ceremony, the handshakes, the state dinner, is already over. This summit is not finished. What happens in the next 24 to 48 hours on Taiwan, on Iran, on trade, could set the direction of U.S.-China relations for years. Will Beijing use what Washington needs to extract a concession no previous administration was willing to make? Will Trump hold the line, or will something be quietly traded away in language too subtle for a headline? Drop your read in the comments. Do you think Xi comes out of this summit stronger than Trump, or is managed stability actually a win for both sides? Subscribe so you don't miss every update as Day 2 unfolds. The next development could reframe everything we thought we understood about Day 1.